Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In this second part of my Constitutional Detective Christmas treat, I am going to explore the story of Ada, who was the young woman who accompanied Dulcie on her Section 92 protected trip across state borders from Sydney to Perth. This is a story of desertion, bigamy, and the tragedy of mistaken identity in a battle at sea. So hang in there, it's a good one. Okay, so going back to the beginnings, Ada was born in 1915. That was a year after her friend Dulcie. Now, Ada's father, William Hawthorne, was a farmer. In 1935, at the age of 20, Ada got married. She married a fellow called Virgil Wesson Fleming, who thankfully has such an unusual name. He's fairly easy to trace in documents in archives and newspapers. Anyway, they were married at St Barnabas's Church in Sydney, and Ada was described on the marriage certificate as being a factory hand, while her husband Virgil, who had previously been in the Navy from the age of 15, was by that stage out of the Navy and described as a roofer, being presumably someone who repairs roofs. But the marriage was soon in trouble. Ada later claimed that she was deserted by her husband within 6 months of marriage. So the following year, Ada commenced proceedings against Virgil under the Deserted Wives and Children Act for the payment of £1 a week in maintenance. And when Virgil failed to pay, he was later arrested for disobeying a court order, and Ada was paid her money. Now, the same year that Ada was seeking her maintenance from her deserted husband, or her husband who deserted her, Virgil, she was actually living as a wife of another man called George Fogo. In a funeral notice upon the death of George's father a couple of years later, George and Ada were described as the loving son and daughter-in-law. So to all apparent the community, society, George and Ada were married. But in fact, they weren't married because Ada was still actually legally married to Virgil, husband number one, who had deserted her. In 1940, 2 days before George, who was a tram conductor, enlisted in the armed forces during World War II, he and Ada married, or at least went through a service of marriage in a church in Annandale. Ada was listed on his enlistment forms in 1940 as George's wife. Ada later claimed that she did get her divorce from Virgil a couple of months after she married George. But that actually wasn't so. It is the case that she submitted the papers to get a divorce from Virgil in February 1940, so that was before her wedding to George, but her marriage to Virgil was not actually formally dissolved until May 1944, so the wheels of divorce clearly went very slowly in New South Wales at that time. Now, the grounds for divorce, as set out in her petition in 1940, were, quote, that he has without just cause or excuse willfully deserted me, and without any such cause or excuse left me continuously so deserted during 3 years and upwards. Now, Ada claimed in documents seeking a limitation on fees in relation to her divorce proceedings that she was living with a friend and was unemployed and had no income. Now, that also was not true, because actually she was living with George Fogo as his wife, being supported by him, and was shortly to marry him. Now, George embarked overseas in the armed services on the 19th of July 1941. And where did he go? Singapore. So he arrived in Singapore in August 1941, and within 6 months, Singapore was captured by the Japanese, and so was George. So George became a prisoner of war in the Changi POW camp. By 1943, we know that George was in a Thai camp, and he may have been involved in building the Thai-Burma Railway. We're not absolutely sure about that. Ada would have been told that he was alive, but he was a prisoner of war in early 1943. Now, in May 1944, as we know, Ada's divorce to husband number one, Virgil, was finally granted. Virgil had indeed not even contested the divorce. Now, while husband number two, George, was being held captive in a POW camp, Ada lost no time in marrying husband number three on the 27th of June 1944, who was an American sailor. Now, his name was James Wesley Stubberfield. The marriage occurred in Queensland. James himself had been born in 1920 in Arkansas. And on the marriage certificate, it lists Ada's maiden name as Hawthorne, which is correct, and her subsequent married name as Fleming. So that was Virgil's surname. So the surname of husband number one. And it notes that she was divorced, which was true, because by the time she married husband number three, she had now been divorced from husband number one. So James and Ada married in a Presbyterian church in Ann Street in Brisbane on the 5th July 1944, when Ada was 28 years old and James was just 23. James was a machinist in the Navy and he served on a submarine, the USS Growler. After a brief period of what we hope was married bliss, he was sent off to war again in the Pacific in his submarine. Now, it's then when the most remarkable thing happened. As Dulcie was planning her infamous train trip to Perth with her friend Ada, submitting her application for a travel permit, Ada's husband, number three, James Stubblefield, was preparing for battle. He served in his submarine in a wolf pack of 3 US submarines which had spotted a Japanese convoy. Unbeknownst to James and his colleagues, that convoy was transporting Allied prisoners of war. And yes, you guessed it, on one of those ships was Ada's husband number two, George Fogo. So 2 of Ada's husbands, who probably didn't know of each other's existence, were engaged in mortal combat despite being on the same side. Now, the Japanese ship upon which George was, the Rakuyu Maru, was sunk in the attack off East Hainan Island on the 12th of September 1944. It actually took 13 hours to sink. Some of the prisoners were picked up by the Japanese, other prisoners were picked up by US submarines and survived. But George Fogo was not amongst them. Now, George's death was not recorded on his military record until the 29th of October 1944 due to uncertainty as to what had happened and whether or not he'd survived. It's unclear whether the news of George's death was sent to Ada immediately, especially given her recent arrival in Perth, because this is around the time that she travelled from Sydney to Perth. We do know, however, that when Ada was interviewed by officials about the trip by Mr. Gratwick from Gratwick and Johnson on the 6th of November 1944, Ada said that she had lived with Dulcie since her husband had been taken as a POW in Singapore, and that she therefore wished to accompany Dulcie on her trip to Perth. She made no reference to George actually having died, so we think that at that stage in November she probably was still unaware of his death. But it is interesting that she was claiming that George was her husband rather than James Stubblefield at that stage. Now, 2 days later, after giving that interview, Ada's third husband, James Stubbleworth, died when his submarine, the USS Growler, was struck in an attack in the Pacific. So in the course of 3 months, divided by her train trip from Sydney to Perth, Ada had lost 2 husbands, although the legitimacy of her marriages to them remained, of course, in question. Now, this caught up with Ada in December 1945 when she was charged and pleaded guilty to bigamy. And that bigamy was for having married George Fogo when she was still married to Virgil Fleming. In the proceedings, Ada claimed that she had already been notified of George Fogo's death before she then married James Stubblefield. But as I've just outlined, that was untrue. And we know now that both George and James were purportedly married to her at the time that they were actually engaged in the same battle that led to George's death. Nonetheless, her claim to have been widowed twice during the war did evoke the sympathy of the judge. So Ada was placed on a good behaviour bond of £50 for 3 years. Judge Holden pointed to the extenuating circumstances of having lost 2 husbands to the war and said that he did not propose to impose a jail sentence on this unfortunate woman. Ada, by this stage, was only 30 years old. She had been deserted by 1 husband, and 2 other husbands had been killed in battles. While she wasn't telling the judge the truth, one can certainly agree with him in feeling sympathy for this poor, unfortunate woman. Now that, as far as I know, is the end of the story of Dulcie and Ada, who were really the Thelma and Louise of Section 92 back in the 1940s. They may well indeed have driven off a cliff because from that point on, their names are lost to time. Perhaps they married, perhaps they lived happy lives and had children and families afterwards. One can only hope so. If anyone can fill in the gaps about the story of Dulcie and Ada, I for one would be very interested, and hopefully anyone else watching this video would be too. So again, please do add any information in the comments. Hopefully we can find some descendant of Dulcie or Ada who can fill us in with the rest of the story. So thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you have enjoyed this Christmas treat of constitutional detective and the stories of Dulcie and Ada. Ordinary transmission back to real constitutional stuff will happen soon. Thank you. Goodbye.